Okay, what we're going to talk about today is how the Greeks were the ones that wrote the Bible, the Old and the New Testament, but the New Testament actually has Roman leanings. Of course, there is a concept of Greco-Roman. We know how their gods transpose to each other and so on. So what we're looking at here is a timeline, just a basic timeline, and on your far left here is Mesopotamia, showing you back at 3700 BC, but we know that it actually goes back much further than that. But at the time that they became full-blown loaded civilization, if you will, was before the ancient Egyptians, which are next, leading up to India, which was hundreds of years later, and then through the Buddha and stuff. What we're missing in this whole epoch here is, of course, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, as we're known, that come across and span this whole thing, and it would actually come from before, and a wave before that were known as the Natufians, from the Wayback Machine just after the last ice age, who apparently had a lot to do with Göbekli Tepe and things like that. But where we're going to try to concentrate more is somewhere right here in the middle of it, where you see that in 1850 BC, ancient China got started up, and that still has to do with Proto-Europeans as well as India. But then you see ancient Israel and how it's mentioned, and that's a photo of a wall that has a few blonde-haired people mixed in on it. It's neither here nor there, really. I've got enough videos about that to choke a horse. But then after that, you're looking at what becomes 900 BC, the ancient Greeks, and then the Romans. And then to about 300 BC, Imperial China. A Mayan civilization, Japanese civilization happens far later after this. And then they show medieval period, and then coming to a modern time over here out the side of it here. But we're focusing on this concept because there were a whole lot of mystery schools and mystery stories that were only known to the adept. Certain cuneiform tablets now allude to this idea, and where even in the Sumerians they seem to have had this idea to transpose a story and make it a little different. It's why you find a few creation myths and things like that that goes on, and then of course a blending with the Akkadians later and so on, and blending their myths in. In fact, what seemed to be a real hip thing to do for the Greeks of the time that we're talking about was to actually take two different things and conflagrate them together. Take what you kind of know about this one, and take what you know about this one, and then put them together and make that a third person. See, that three thing has a lot of symbology to these people. Numerology had a lot to do with it too. In fact, they agreed that all is number. But that's probably more revealed in the videos I have about sacred geometry. So what we're looking at here is a timeline that far spans any idea of what you would be calling the Bible era and what we talk about. In fact, somewhere around in here is where you get the origin of it, and they just seem to pop up out of Egypt, out of nowhere, after the before time is all explained away with Adam and then the first cities. But of course that has to do with Mesopotamia over here, and then into Egypt and so on. But how could we say that the Greeks were the ones that were behind this? Well, a lot of people are well aware that the very first that we have of any of this is in the Septuagint, and that was a college of people that had gotten together and written this. What you don't realize is that college that got together and did this was one of these mystery schools that had all been working off the Greek ideals for a long time, and whenever each one of those was actually to graduate, they actually would have to write their own little story and do one of these conflagration deals, and they'd be kind of judged upon it too. So it's something that they would have been schooled on how to do and given so many examples that we don't even have record of today. Those have all burned away. All of the things that would be telltale have almost went away. There are some Dead Sea Scrolls and what people call Gnostic stuff that really show something. Can show you more how it really was at the time. This is an article here that talks about how the Old Testament is all about Jesus, and that how Jesus himself taught that he carried more authority than any prophet that predated him, although Jesus regarded John as the greatest prophet up to himself. He says so in Matthew. He claimed his own testimony was weightier or had more megas than that of John. He says that in John 5:36. Jesus certainly wasn't denying John or a previous true prophet was divinely inspired, but he just as clearly was claiming that his revelatory authority trumped everything leading up into himself, that he actually was the one that you've been waiting on this whole time. I find it odd that it seems almost there was 2,000 years of talking about these things from the ancient Sumerians leading up until this point, and really a little more than that, and that actually leads to zodiacal ages and how things changed and flipped over time. And a lot of people looking into this have realized that it was an age of Taurus, and that's the reason everybody has bull horns on them. And then due to later things that happened on that, they turned around and made that bad. And so now if you have goat or bull horns on you, you have to have been that pagan thing, and you have to be worshiping the devil, which is actually a conflagration too. We'll get into that a little bit. But in fact, in this same passage, Jesus goes as far as to claim that he is the ultimate subject matter of previous revelations. In the course of confronting the Pharisees, he says, "You study the scriptures diligently because you think in them you possess eternal life. These are for very scriptures that testify about me, yet you refuse to come to me to have life." Now, a lot of people have realized that this is all sun worship and how it's coming full circle with Jesus, that all these other things all come and stem from the original, which was sun worshiping. And then they had gods and goddesses of all kinds of places, and then they had the gods of their rivers, and each separate river had its own nymph and goddess, and all of these things went in with it. And of course, if there's an upper gods, there has to be a lower gods for whenever you die, and you have this, and we recognize it as hell today, but hell is not the place listed in your Bible and described in it in any way. In fact, hell comes from European early thoughts and concepts and druids and everything like that. I've showed other videos about that. But it also even says Hades in the Bible a few times. I made a video about that a long time ago, and if y'all are still keeping up, I'm finally getting around to doing this, and I guess this gets to be another video in my category that I have called It's All Greek. So, for this reason, Jesus claimed that Moses would serve as their accuser, and accuser is, of course, Satan. If you look up Moses had horns, it'll show you a picture of Moses having horns, but this is just changing from the age of the bull, where the sacred golden calf turns into the age of Aries. It's amazing, just like the age of Aries and the lamb of Jesus turned into the age of Pisces and the fish. And you wonder why those cards have that little fish symbol on them and so on, and then one of the first things he does is do fish at a wedding and so on. Problem with that is that's already been done by somebody else, and the water into wine situation is something from the Bacchian mysteries or Dionysus, where he could do the same thing. In fact, Moses is taking and making water from a rock actually comes from the same Dionysian mysteries, where out in the wilderness they were able to strike a rock and either get water or wine out of it, and could turn water into wine. Well, the mystery in that is the fact that you don't want to drink regular water, that you do want to drink wine, but they watered it down extremely, extremely bad, 4 or 5 to 1. It's not the same kind as we have today situation, it doesn't take just 1 or 2 glasses of wine to get something in you. And although if you drank it like that, and a lot of people looked at you weird whenever you tried to, because you were just trying to get drunk. So for Jesus also added, if you believed Moses, then you would believe me, for he wrote about me. Well, that was all sun worship and things too, and I've got other videos about that, so I don't need to go into it too much. But Jesus made the same point to certain disciples after his resurrection. After chiding them for being slow to believe all that the prophets had spoken about him, Jesus explained his death and resurrection by teaching them that everything was written about him in the law of Moses and the prophets of Psalms, and they had to be fulfilled. Y'all are familiar with this. And in this way, he opened their minds so he could understand the scriptures. On Jesus' day, the phrase, the law, the prophets, and Psalms was widely used to refer to the Old Testament, which had been going on for a period of time now, but it's not near as old as some people in their mind have a belief that it was. Some people want to have the belief that it was carried on by people from before and everything. No, it was something that came after. There's no real mentions of it before, but wait, there's so many pagan people, which just means agriculture is before. The Alpha and the Omega concept that we all hear about, these are Greek letter forms actually, and if you take and look at it closely, they're actually the first and last letter of the Greek alphabet. And it says it's a title of cross, and it's a mix of Chi, Rho, and something else that I did videos about already. So we can add this into the concept here, but why would he say that he's the very first and last of the Greek alphabet? Now, I've heard apologetics on this concept where people try to say, well, no, that's because the Greeks rewrote it. Whenever they did, they used their first and last letter of their alphabet. Well, alphabet comes from the alpha and the beta. And he actually says it like 5 times here. Oh, let me shrink that down for you here. He actually, at 5 different places, makes a mention to this here. And it's in Revelations generally, but also in Isaiah 44:6 down here at the bottom. It shows that. But also, strangely, it tells you that, behold, I was dead, and behold, I live forevermore, and I have the keys of death and of Hades. This is the actual real translation. If you get the old, you can go to BibleHub.com and turn around and click on all kinds of different forms of the Bible if you want, from the New Testament to the New Living, this, that, and the other. All different forms. But if you take the original Hebrew and get it transcribed where it shows you the words that are there, and it's not quite exactly the same in all situations. But it does show you that it does say these words before in it, of course, and so on. And that's the earliest one they have, and the earliest transformed of is Hades at that time. In the more modern forms, they try to turn that into hell, and actually hell is not Gehenna or Sheol, which is what the name was in the first place, showing you that it has not really been created by the people that are doing this. But that's just one small thing that can be shown here. For there's a lot more, but Alpha and Omega, and I did a recent video on it, just straightforward this concept, kind of a short one and so on. But this book of Revelations that we talk about, and of course everybody knows this is in the Bible, it's the last book of the Bible. And in having that last book of the Bible, it was supposedly written by John, and they tell you that academia, 2nd century Christian writers such as Papias of Hierapolis, Justin Martyr that we hear so much about, Irenaeus, Melito of Sardis, Clement of Alexandria, in the Library of Alexandria, and the author of Mauritanian fragment identified John the Apostle as John of Revelation, but modern scholarships generally take a different view, with many considering that nothing can be known about the author except for that he was a Christian prophet, and people tried to name it after John. Modern theological scholars characterize the book of Revelation's author as John of Patmos. The bulk of traditional sources date that book to the reign of Roman Emperor Domitian at 81 to 96 AD. So after 73 AD, after all of this had already happened, originally being written. I saw a scholar talk about this one time, and there are a few words in there that were not said in that way until at this point here. And if you want to give him credit of being the first person that coined the new way to say it, it still puts it past the date. So that's which evidence kind of tends to confirm, but also in some of my older videos I talk about how there is Oannes. See, there was no J in ancient times. There was no Jesus because his name was Dionysus, which actually you can find being written about Horus in one of his names, which in that mean anointed, which is again what we claim that the title of Christ meant. And whenever you find out about what was in that anointing oil they all talked about, it starts to make a little more sense and a whole lot of difference into the reality of what was going on and the way people thought at the time. The book spans 3 literary genres: epistolary, apocalyptic, and prophetic. And it begins with John on the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea addressing a letter to the 7 churches of Asia. No other places. This is all where Caucasians live. He described a series of prophetic visions, including figures such as the 7-headed dragon, the serpent, and the beast, which culminated in the second coming of Jesus. Now you see there was this great serpent thing, the old serpent worship, so we have that all there. And the beast concept, of course, but when we go with the 7-headed dragon, even my brother, which is a deacon at a church and extremely well into this and so much of a believer, would tell you and has talked to me about it personally that that actually is designating Rome with the 7 heads and the 7 mounts that were there and everything else. And then a lot of people have shown him that that is true enough to where he totally believes it. The only thing is that we're missing is the final seal, and see the final seal busts and then something happens, and so you'd be sitting here waiting for an asteroid to hit us, which they keep flying by every year, and people keep not even seeing them till after they got past us. And if one of a decent size was to sneak through right now, for 10,000 years again, people would be claiming that this actually happened, instead of the reality of an asteroid. And we sat here not doing anything about it, knowing well now that we know the Younger Dryas was caused by it and so much calamities. Sure, there are volcanoes that have caused an incredible amount of problem, and we really can't stop that unless we can figure out a giant dump truck plane that's a dump truck that can dump cement all at one time that fast hardens, or I don't know, shoot down into it with a nuclear thing. See, this would all be a mistake, wouldn't it? But if something was flying at us, they always talk about if you were to blow it up with nuclear stuff, then it just makes a bunch of smaller stuff, so that's not any better, it could be worse. No, it'd be a whole bunch of things streaking through the atmosphere and not causing near as much problem as if one hits. It really starts to multiply. Whenever you get a little bit bigger than a baseball or football stadium that still makes it all the way through the atmosphere and hits the ground, between that and 3 or 4 times the size of that is the difference between an area of, or a state you think of in the United States being obliterated out, and then everything downwind to the point that it's a whole continent. And if you double that size, here we go with the dinosaur thing again. So, not to go far off of that, but then there's the serpent, and of course this goes back to Tiamat, and it goes back to the ones that you even hear in the Bible, and Leviathan and so on like that, that has to do with Levites. And John that we talked about is Oannes, right? And you can look it up, and the New Testament was originally written in Greek, right? And it's a well-known fact that the Hebrew language was, people thought that it was Hebrew and then got turned into Greek. But then they studied the whole thing and they failed to realize that Hebrew had ceased to be spoken by the Jews centuries before the New Testament era under the Babylon and Medo-Persian empires of 640 to 333 BC. Back in that time, Aramaic exerted greatest influence. The writings of Daniel, who lived and worked during the time of the Chaldean and Persian empires, show the extensive influence of Syriac and Chaldean, which we know about the Ur of the Chaldees, which were dialects of Aramaic style. The Persians ruled Palestine from the time of Daniel and Ezra until its invasion by Alexander the Great in 333 BC. From the time of influence of Aramaic was overshadowed by the influence of Greek. Samuel G. Green, renowned biblical scholar, described the significant change as follows: as a direct result of the conquests of Alexander the Great and his successors, the Greek tongue had been carried into almost all the countries of the civilized world and had become the medium of commercial intercourse and, in fact, the universally literal tongue, or lingua franca, of the provinces. Afterwards, all got absorbed into the Roman Empire. So, one way that's strange to look about this is, I've made a video about this too, there was just a small period of time where these people even ruled in the area that they now have a new place in as of after World War II. We don't need to get into that and how that happened, but this area was all the Levant and Canaanites, if you will, all through this time and after. And a lot of these places that were harbors you would know as the Phoenicians, all the way around the Mediterranean, which actually meant Middle Earth, and still does if you translate it out, because of North Africa, above the Sahara, and all the way around. They didn't really know sub-Saharan Africa existed, but then they tell you that the Phoenicians made it all the way around there. There are a lot of weird tales that go along with that too, but that's not what this video is about. Let's just continue a little bit here. So it wasn't the language that was really being known at the time, and then in fact actually it got to a different point because they were always under somebody. There's only a small window in time where they were, well, they really never were. It was always up under Egypt, which had run all the way up to Syria, or under Canaanite rule itself, or up under people that were the Phoenicians, pretty much. And they talk down about them because they've got to flip it and turn it around. But that's really the way it became. So here's an article here. Was the Bible influenced by Greek mythology? That's what we kind of wanted to get into. Let's look at this as a whole article here instead of just the face. So here's the whole article here. Was the Bible influenced by Greek mythology? Well, in looking at the many world's religions, one can find similarities at nearly every turn in the stories if you just look. Sometimes it's veiled in just the concepts of an idea where this three things kind of happens. Now the story behind it's totally different, and see, that's taken from something else quite often and put together with it. You get the idea of what I'm talking about with the mystery schools and things before. Most involve the world being created by a higher power, a separation of that higher power from mankind, a great flood that covered the land at one time, a human representation of that higher power, an emphasis on war, and some way of redemption. This is something that goes back before recorded time that we have. An all-powerful sky father and a sun god. While myths differ from religions in that religion is more all-encompassing term, many mythological accounts of events, especially Greek mythology, correlate with those in the Christian Bible. There are differences in the creation stories with some similar essentials, such as the world beginning in darkness, like it says in Genesis. In Greek mythology, this darkness is called chaos, but that is also alluded to in the ancient Sumerians, in the Egyptians, and so on. And darkness signifies chaos and the unknown, because it's on the other side of the planet. When the sun's up here and when the sun's over there, we're in darkness. Chaos is the beginning of all things, and from this darkness came the earth, Gaia, Arche of the Sumerians, and Eros, which represented love, and the underworld, or Tartarus. And in a Christian Bible, God speaks, then it is so, with a word, or so on. Where in Greek mythology, it is many gods who are responsible for bringing the world and the universe into being, and the Bible gives credit to only one, God himself. Well, there's also a concept here where they do have the word and the logos, and that's Greek, and that's a Greek concept. See, a lot of people can't get past the fact that nomadic goat herders, which they try to pretend these people are here, wouldn't have the prose or ability to write a thing as delicate and as intricate and all-encompassing as the Bible. It just wouldn't happen. Not to not give credit to who they're trying to give credit to, it just doesn't happen. And of course, allegories are all over the Bible, where a woman grows from a rib and eats from a magic tree because a giant talking snake told her to. And you're able to get past that. And that's at the very first of it, by the way, but I'll get into that here in a moment. Chaos and Gaia were brought together through Eros, through love, and produced the heavens and solar system. Now, this is the same idea you see in Egypt, where one is bounding over the other. And if you look in the Bible, they talk about the face of the deep is over the face of God is over the face of the deep, and that's actually a sexual connotation in our idea, where creation is formed. In the same way, Uranus, along with the seas and mountains of the earth, make all of this. There are lesser gods created from this as well, known as the Titans. Each god presided over one aspect of nature or survival. Human beings are said to have been created possibly from these gods. However, there are some Greek societies who believed that mankind sprung from the earth, much as the Christian Bible speaks of God creating man from the dust. Well, if you look at the ancient Sumerians, who the Greeks got a lot of their stuff for, as I've shown in Apollo and a lot of vids before, like I say, we're just adding on to the idea of it's all Greek. But whenever we see that idea that it says it was created from the dust or dust of the earth, the actual, in the Sumerians talk about it being the afar. They use the same representation whenever they talk about rebuilding a house. Like it starts to get run down, what do? Well, you break it down and you kind of save the bricks. And that's the afar, or the refuge, or something that's already there, rather than to make new, that you try to save as much as possible, and then you rebuild out of that. So there's a little different concept, and a lot of thoughts go along with that connect to the idea of how humanity came back in after that Younger Dryas event. Now, that probably was the original flood story. And then the one we have in the Bible is well proven was the ancient Sumerian flood. But it was just a localized flood, and it only got as deep as, well, they talk about even in the Bible, if you leave out the phrase, and over the hills. Of course, only some 18 cubits deep, but you can imagine how from the floodplains that would have just flooded everything all up and took people out. The lament of Inanna and the lament of actually, which I've read out before, explains this. So, another notable difference is the belief of one power as being omnipotent in the Christian faith and the appearance of several gods in Greek lore. Chaos was the beginning, however, many gods took on the role of a deity. One such god was Chronos, god of the harvest, who was the product of Uranus and Gaia. And it is said that Chronos was jealous of his father and wanted his position of ruling the heavens. You'll find that in a lot of people's stories where they worry about their own kids trying to take over too early or try to kill them off, because that happens sometimes. And therefore, they put it into story, into people's ancient myths. And of course, any time that there was an unknown death for a certain reason, they always thought you got poisoned or something happened. Or you got taken over by a demon because they didn't understand quite how everything works. He proceeded to castrate Uranus, whose blood is spilled, and they created more gods, thus the tipping the balance in the favor of Chronos. Uranus was furious, and it is thought that the word Titan came from the word Titanus, or strained ones, saying they had stepped over the line. And he also warned Chronos that he would suffer the same fate and be cast out by one of his own sons. Well, if you'll read what they actually said about Chronos, is that he had to sacrifice his own kids so they would stay alive whenever he was besieged by a great trouble or strife in ancient days there in the land of Canaan. And so, his name was Eudid, and in Attic Greek it would be Dionysus. And there was no J. And it's said that they named the land about him, after him, his child here, that it had to happen to. So I wonder where this land of Judea is, whenever Judea is the name that they gave the land for Chronos' kid. Spelled the same way, there was no J. Just go on here. The way Chronos decided to deal with this was to swallow each of his children as soon as they were born, this idea that they had to kill off his lineage. However, his mate, who was also to be his sister, sought to find a way to save her last child, which was Zeus. She gave birth without Chronos' knowledge somehow, and tricked him into thinking he had swallowed the last of his offspring, as well as giving him a stone wrapped in coverings. Now he's supposed to be this giant creature, and they ended up giving him a stone to him. And it's later said that poison hit him, and he had to herp everybody back up, right? Chronos then ruled over the gods, thinking that he had escaped his own fate, all the while his son Zeus being raised in secret on a myriad of different places, but most popularly a cave inside on an island. But when Zeus became old enough, he poisoned his father and made him regurgitate all his siblings. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades declared war on and captured Chronos. He was then held captive in the underworld, while Zeus claimed the rule over the heavens and placed himself on Mount Olympus. Now, this could show you also where in ancient days they kept at least some essence of the story of one group taking over another. But it's conflagrated in an idea of, yes, we kicked their ass. Just like all the Proto-European ones we talked about, how it's once they came in and the brownies and the fairies and this, that, and the other, and they go, yeah, and we kicked their ass. Who? Us, which is actually them us kind of mix now. It's an adoptive way of doing it. Poseidon ruled the sea, and Hades was in charge of the underworld. One might say that it was an extreme measure for Chronos to eat his own children to keep his prophecy from coming true, but in actual reality, it seems like he had to kill off his own children in the other way that I talked about before. But indeed, it was no more heinous than King Herod, perhaps, demanding that all newborn babies be killed whenever the three magi told him about Christ's birth. See, Herod was understandably nervous, for he was the king, and now he was going to be told who the true king's birth was, and this is a mockery of that same situation. Yeah, and it has to do with threes too, and we'll talk about that later, but the three magi are actually the belt of Orion. When the Magi couldn't locate him quickly enough, King Herod ordered that all newborns in Bethlehem be killed, but Jesus only escaped his fate by remaining hidden and going into Egypt, which is actually a typology where that keeps happening, where he run off into Egypt. And so he wouldn't be recognized there as being very much different than anybody. It's pretty easy to do, just like Moses, because they were all the same type of people. Forbidden knowledge, the Bible and Greek mythology. At this point, the similarities between the Bible and Greek mythology start to become less vague and more specific, really. In both accounts, the female character is said to be the one who brings the separation of man and God. Yeah, there's something that happened, and I think women get the idea. The reason they haven't really challenged it is that, yeah, there was something that went on a long time ago. There was goddess worship and so on, but somehow there was something caused by that that was worse than even the ideas that we come up with. The Bible states that Eve fell victim to the temptation of Satan. You know, she grew from a rib and ate from a magic tree, that forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge. She led in Adam to even do the same as well, and even though God had specifically told them not to, this act forever separates man from God. Well, I did another video about this too. I mean, you can look at things from 100 different ways, and so I've done about 12 of them on Genesis. Ironic number, huh? But in that fact, I did one showing you that what they really say is that these people, if they were to do that, would become like gods of this earth. And people don't realize, you know, the heralds of civilization and how all that happened and how it turned out. And of course you can go, oh, well, see, the prophets, and they knew what was going on. It was written way after the fact, once they realized that they were and who they were, and how things got screwed up before, with the sons of God breeding with the daughters of man. But let's not go there right now. So in the Greek version, it's Pandora, who I did a video about here last year, and talking about this same Eve connection in its ways. So this ought to make another connection on that spider web. Out of curiosity, she opens this jar where all the evils of mankind are kept, and the jar was to be kept closed, but in the creation of Pandora, Zeus was punishing mankind even to begin with. And the only thing that she kept inside of it was hope. It's the only thing left at the bottom of the bottle, or jar, or chest. Prometheus had given man the secret of fire, therefore giving them the ability to learn things for themselves. In the name Prometheus, you get the idea of Theos and the gods, and Pro, and this idea of before, and how that was an idea, and these people that used to worship fire because it was a piece of the sun that you got going on and you had control over it, so you could do a lot with it. It really was one of the big stepping stones leading to modern man in the way back machine, and people even of this time, and still to this day with Zoroastrianism and so on, have that connection to it. So this also gave them the ability for them to learn things for themselves. And some people think that it had an idea in the Bible that we were all supposed to be dumb and running around like animals, and we were only going to be vegetarians, and that no animals used to attack each other, and then all of a sudden Eve did something and it caused all this problem. But if you look at it, that's really a different way of telling this story here. But the thing that I keep showing you and keep mentioning, because they keep talking about Greeks and they're going to talk about Egypt, is the fact that it has a lot to do with Sumerians, which the Greeks had a lot to do with, as per my videos. And that a lot of these stories come from there, but it was always forgotten. Babylon was looked at as being heinous, just like it was tried to be looked at as anything Canaanite would be done so. Right? So in that fact, it was pretty much omitted until we found the Sumerian tablets and they started getting them figured out. We're going to go to part 2 here in your top left hand corner. Click up there on the one that's showing up now, and I'll see you there. Hey, leave a like before you go, and any comments that you got, just pause it, and I'll see you there. Peace.